Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to the Rocket Top. My name is Philip and today we're going to talk about Starship's first not-so-orbital test flight and filter out what we did learn from a 3-minute flight, a series of 360s and a successful test of the flight termination system. So unless you've been living under a rock in the last few days, you may have seen at least a few photos of the inaugural test flight of a fully stacked Starship Super Heavy system. Shortly after 8:30 AM Central Time on the morning of, at last Thursday, fittingly the 20th of April, if you know you know, Starship finally took to the skies. Despite aiming for orbit, it didn't really get that far as it reached an apogee of around 39 kilometers, tumbled out of control, pulled multiple backflips and finally got terminated about 3.5 minutes into the flight. That is what unfolded before our eyes. Despite blowing up and having quite a few problems on the way up, SpaceX did evaluate this test flight as a success since Starship did take off, something that wasn't granted at all. But apart from the obvious, there are some additional takeaways. On the eventually pretty short flight of Booster 7 and Ship 24, a lot of things went wrong. It actually surprises me that the full stack even got all the way to 39 kilometers in altitude, considering all the failures we had occurring on that vehicle. The easiest thing to notice is of course the insane amount of engine failures that occurred over the course of the flight. I mean, when we first got to see the engine bay after liftoff, 3 engines were already out, meaning they most likely shut down instantly after engine ignition. That also would explain why Starship sat on the pad for around 6 seconds without lifting off, maybe because SpaceX were evaluating whether to launch or not, but who knows. Anyway, after already starting on 30 out of 33 engines, a further 2 failed shortly after, with a 6th going out as well. Depending on the angle and the time into the flight, some shots actually show up to 8 engines failing, a full quarter of all the Raptors on board. Not only did all those failing engines reduce the total thrust available to the booster by a drastic amount, but since almost all of the engines failed on the same side of the vehicle, giving it a lot of asymmetric thrust, also explaining the massive power slide off the pad shortly after liftoff. But apart from the engines, a whole lot more failed on ascent. For example, at around T plus 30 seconds, a pretty huge explosion can be seen rocking the bottom of the vehicle with parts falling off. Based on the later events of the flight as well as the position of the explosion, this probably was one of the hydraulic pressure units or HPUs supplying the hydraulic pressure for the thrust vector control of the center 13 engines. While I personally do not know how many HPUs are mounted inside the booster, I believe it is 2 but I'm not sure, this prevented at least some of the center 13 engines from gimbaling, if not all of them, meaning the booster was basically not controllable from that certain point on. At around 2.5 minutes into flight, the vehicle began to tumble after having lost up to 8 engines, some of them combusting themselves and having suffered a critical loss of control mechanisms. By that point, the booster was literally a flying wreck. As for the loss of control itself, the most likely cause are simply aerodynamic forces lasting on the vehicle while it was pitching up trying to gain altitude, as it was operating under low thrust and therefore far too low. The very design of the ship with the aerodynamic surfaces makes the vehicle unstable in flight, meaning it tends to flip uncontrollable, but that is normally corrected by the booster. But since the booster had almost no control left over itself and had a significant thrust asymmetry going on, Booster 7 not only wasn't able to correct the tumble, but probably even made it worse. Although the stage separation maneuver, which involves a flip maneuver, was announced to be happening on stream around that time, but it likely never did. since the vehicle was seen pitching down, not up as it was supposed to be during stage separation. But either way, the flight couldn't have reached orbit with all those failures happening in just under 3 minutes. Even if the main goal of this flight, which was not blowing up on the launch pad, was achieved and the vehicle made it all the way to the stratosphere, the launch pad damage is a whole lot worse than many of us imagined. When replaying the moment of liftoff, a literal hail of debris can be seen impacting the ground around the pad and even plunging into the nearby ocean. Closer to the vehicle, huge chunks can be seen being launched into the air by violent forces. That was what we could see during the launch itself already, but the aftermath of it was, well, unexpectedly brutal. As you may or may not know, Starship's launch mount isn't equipped with a flame diverter. These things normally deflect the engine exhaust off to the side to not mess up the foundations of the pad. Well, in Starbase, there is nothing more than a thick slab of reinforced concrete. This right here is what the slab looked like before the launch, but now it looks like this. Well, to put that simply, there is no more concrete slab. The immense force of 33 Raptor engines initially impacting the concrete directly from above eroded it so fast that the concrete was broken off the metal rebar it was reinforced with, leaving only floating metal rods behind. After having burned through the slab, the engine exhaust dug a literal crater into the foundations of the launch mount, reaching at least 5 meters into the ground. And where did all this concrete go? Well, across the launch site, into the tank farm, denting several tanks severely, into the sky, and critically, also smashing into the engine bay of the booster. Seeing how many of those engines on Booster 7 did appear to fail in pairs right next to each other, with 2 neighboring engines failing right after ignition, it is more than likely that many of those engines were impacted and partially destroyed by concrete chunks flying around. The insane forces of all the engines hammering onto the concrete for 6 to 10 seconds set everything beneath the pad flying up into the air, launching concrete chunks into nearby pad infrastructure, a poor NASA spaceflight camera van, into the rocket itself, and basically everywhere near the pad. Smaller bits of concrete and sand could even be found in Port Isabel, a local town which is more than 8 kilometers away from the pad. But despite all the debris flying around, the place it came from is of way more concern for SpaceX. Seeing that the foundations of the launch mount are basically completely gone, SpaceX will have to do a lot of repairs and enhancement to that thing before it can be used again. Luckily, SpaceX appears to have a water-cooled metal shield in the works here, which should be installed in the next few months before the next launch, which Elon Musk said could happen in as soon as 2 months. Given the standard conversion factor between his time perception and real time of round about 3.8, we can expect the next orbital flight near the end of this year in November or December. Destroying the launch pad will really slow things down, especially since further damage would mean having a reusable rocket launching from an expendable launch pad, which isn't optimal. But the one positive takeaway from this test flight is just how sturdy Starship really is. It lost up to 8 engines, got battered by flying concrete and had an internal explosion, but it still managed to rise into the sky and got pretty far considering all of this. And even when it began to violently pull multiple 360s under full thrust, it still structurally held up and didn't break apart until the very moment of FTS activation, of which we for some reason actually have a picture of. For a vehicle made from 4mm thin stainless steel, this is something truly insane to achieve. Combined, the extreme structural loads the full stack can survive, even with massive thrust asymmetries going on, multiple explosions happening, and literally getting bombarded, gives me a lot of faith in future missions that could involve a landing on the Moon or Mars, for example, since it appears that Starship can endure quite a lot before going up in flames on its own. Also, the thermal protection system on the ship seemed to hold up pretty well for the first ever test flight of Starship, seeing that only 4 heat shield tiles can be seen missing in the last moments before explosion. Based on the lessons learned from Starship's first integrated test flight, it is quite clear that it will take a lot of time to sort out all the issues of both the rocket and its ground support equipment, and the latter may very well turn out the more complicated issue. Since we do not know how much of the damage to Booster 7 was caused by the launch pad literally falling apart, we can't really assess just how well or not well the vehicle did perform in flight. But luckily, SpaceX will have enough data to get an idea of that. Either way, the next full stack that could go to orbit, likely Ship 26 and Booster 9, will feature many improvements over the scrappy Booster 7 and Ship 24 already, and future vehicles will incorporate lessons learned from this very flight. For example, already the next booster doesn't have a hydraulic thrust vector control anymore, meaning there is no HPU that could explode. Instead, this job is now done electrically. Also, Ship 26 lacks aerodynamic surfaces, since it is not scheduled to even attempt a successful atmospheric re-entry, and therefore won't bring the vehicle out of balance on ascent. And if that wasn't enough, the engines fitted on both Booster 9 and Ship 26 are way more advanced and improved versions of those on Booster 7 and Ship 24, meaning they probably will see way less engine failures on the way up. Either way, the decisive factor will probably turn out to be the launch pad itself, and that will be quite a challenge to sort out. But SpaceX is already working on a potential solution and is trying to install that on the pad along with replacing all the parts that got wrecked in the next few weeks or months. If they can manage all of that fast enough, there is a substantial chance that this was in fact not the last test flight Starship is going to do this year. And that's already it for my quick rundown on the lessons learned from Starship's first not-so-orbital test flight. Let me know in the comments what you think SpaceX could or should do to get Starship up and running. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, consider smashing that like button and subscribing to the Rocket Tub. It would really mean a lot to me. We see ourselves in the next video, and until then, I'm out. Cheers!